Amira's scream cut through the smoke like a torn thread. 1 second she was laughing at her mother's joke about the crooked birthday candles, and the next, the curtains burst into flame. Her father wasn't home, just her and Mama, and the smell of burning fabric filled the air faster than she could breathe. "Water!" her mother shouted, grabbing a blanket, but the fire ate it before she reached the sink. The heat pressed against Amira's face, pushing her backward. The candles tipped, wax dripping, flames crawling up the wallpaper like hands reaching for her. She stumbled, caught the table edge and fell. Pain split across her palms as glass shattered beneath her. Smoke poured over the room, thick, choking, endless. Her mother's voice broke through it, raw, trembling. "Amira, go. Go outside." But she couldn't see. The hallway was already red. The doorknob burned her skin when she grabbed it. She screamed again, pulled her hand away, then wrapped her sleeve around it and forced the door open. The wind hit her, cold and violent, scattering sparks into the night. Her mother was still inside. Amira turned back. "Mama!" The roof crackled, groaned, then collapsed with a roar that sounded like the earth splitting open. A wall of flame blocked the doorway. She reached for it anyway, as if love could make fire move aside. A neighbor pulled her back, shouting something she couldn't hear. The air tore from her lungs. The world went white. When she woke, the ceiling was pale and unfamiliar. Her hands were wrapped in thick gauze. They pulsed with pain that had no edge, no end. Her father sat beside the bed, silent, eyes fixed on the floor. "Where's Mama?" she whispered. He didn't look up. A nurse entered quietly, checking her bandages, avoiding her eyes. No one answered. The silence told her everything. Days turned into weeks inside that sterile room. The doctors changed her dressings, told her she was lucky to be alive, but she hated that word. Lucky didn't sound like a mother's voice disappearing in smoke. When they finally unwrapped her hands, she saw what the fire had left behind, pale, twisted scars that made her fingers stiff, her palms uneven. She stared at them until her vision blurred. Her father sighed. "We'll manage, Amira," he said softly. "You'll heal." But when she reached for his hand, he flinched without meaning to. It was enough. She saw fear, pity, and distance. All the things that told her she wasn't the same anymore. When they returned to town, neighbors lined the street, whispering behind closed curtains. A woman pressed a tray of food into her father's hands and murmured, "Poor child." The word poor stuck in Amira's chest. At school, eyes followed her like she was a ghost. A boy pointed and laughed. "Look, melted hands," he said, and the hallway filled with giggles. Amira pulled her sleeves down, hid her fingers in her pockets, and walked faster. Teachers smiled too brightly, careful not to stare. But she saw it, the way they hesitated before handing her anything, as if touch could spread what she carried. Her art teacher, Mrs. Lane, once praised her for her perfect brush control. Now she stood over Amira's desk, watching the paintbrush tremble between her fingers. "Maybe you should rest your hands, dear," she said gently. Amira set the brush down. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. The strokes came out uneven, colors bleeding together. By the end of the day, her paper looked like a bruise. She tore it in half before anyone could see. Nights were worse. Every creak of the house sounded like a flame relighting. She dreamed of her mother calling her name through smoke, of reaching and never touching. Her father tried to comfort her, but he was fading too, working late, sleeping on the couch, muttering to himself when he thought she couldn't hear. Once, she found him sitting in the dark, staring at an old photograph of her mother sewing. His eyes were hollow. "She loved that machine," he murmured. Said every stitch held a promise. Then he turned away before Amira could speak. The sewing machine became her only inheritance. Rusted edges, scorched frame, but still working. One afternoon, while her father was out, she turned it on. The hum filled the silence like a heartbeat. She pressed the pedal and guided a piece of old cloth beneath the needle. The thread wobbled, broke, tangled again. She tried until her palms ached. Tears dropped onto the fabric. "Please," she whispered to no one. The needle caught the light, glinting like memory. She pressed again, slower this time. The thread moved straight. The line held. For the first time since the fire, something obeyed her hands. That night she sewed until dawn. Bits of fabric, her mother's apron, and old bedsheet, scraps of curtains, became tiny squares stitched together. It wasn't pretty, but it was hers. When her father found her asleep at the table, he looked at the mess of thread and cloth, then at her bandaged palms. "You shouldn't push yourself," he said. She smiled weakly. "I just wanted to remember her." He hesitated, then touched her shoulder. "She'd be proud." But his voice cracked halfway through, and he left before she could see the tears. Months passed. Amira's sleeves grew longer. Her classmates' stares sharper. She stopped raising her hand in class, stopped eating in the cafeteria. The only time she felt alive was when she sewed. Alone, the machine humming like a secret between her and her mother. But loneliness has a way of whispering lies. One winter morning, she overheard two girls in the hallway. "She still thinks she can be a designer," one said. "Who'd wear clothes made by that?" Their laughter chased her down the corridor. She ran until she reached the art room. The mirror above the sink caught her reflection, thin, pale, trembling. She lifted her hands, unwrapped the gloves, stared at the scars. They looked like rivers frozen mid-flow, twisting, branching, permanent. For a moment, she wanted to break the mirror. Instead, she touched it gently. "You're still here," she whispered. "You're still mine." The fire had taken everything: home, warmth, innocence, but not the pulse beneath her skin. That pulse began to sound like defiance. At night, she stitched faster. Her hands bled, her fingers cramped, but she kept going. She imagined her mother beside her, guiding each thread. When the final piece was done, a small patchwork dress for no one to wear, she held it against the window. The morning light passed through the thin fabric, glowing through every uneven stitch. For a heartbeat, the room filled with color. It looked like forgiveness. Outside, the world was still cruel, still whispering, still blind. But inside that moment, Amira's hands didn't feel broken. They felt alive. She folded the dress carefully and pressed it to her chest. The hum of the sewing machine faded, replaced by silence that didn't hurt anymore. It was the first silence she chose. The fire was gone, but the thread had only just begun to move. Amira didn't open the curtains anymore. The world outside had too many eyes, and every one of them remembered. Every scar, every whisper. "She used to be so pretty," she once overheard a neighbor say. The words clung to her like soot, so she built her life behind fabric, behind silence. The sewing machine became her only voice. Each night she pressed her foot against the pedal, and the hum filled the small house like a heartbeat trying to stay alive. Her father moved through the rooms like a shadow now, present but never whole. He left early for work, returned late, always smelling of iron and oil. Dinner was quiet. 2 plates, one conversation that never happened. Once she tried to tell him about a design idea. Soft blue cotton with stitched petals along the hem. He nodded without looking up from his food. "That's nice, sweetheart." Nice. A word that meant nothing. She stopped showing him anything after that. At school, time moved slower. She'd sit by the window, sketching lines that never turned into dresses. Kids still talked, but never to her. They talked around her, as if she were part of the furniture. Once during art class, a girl dropped a pair of scissors and muttered, "Don't let her touch them. Might melt." The class laughed. Amira didn't. She just gathered her books and walked out. Mrs. Lane called after her, but she kept going until the hallway turned into the empty world she preferred. At home she stitched. Patterns she never showed, colors no one would wear. She found beauty in symmetry, in tiny details that only her burned fingers could understand. She stitched not to sell or impress, but to breathe. Every pull of the needle was a heartbeat. Every completed seam a sentence she couldn't say aloud. On her better days, she imagined her mother sitting across the table, guiding her like before the fire. "Slower, baby. Let the thread tell you what it wants." Her hands no longer trembled the way they once did. The scars had toughened, skin pulling tight, fingers stiff but steady. Each motion was precise, deliberate. Sometimes she forgot they were burned, until she caught her reflection. Then she'd pull her sleeves down again, hide them, as if the world hadn't already decided what she was allowed to show. One afternoon, she heard kids outside her window. "That's the house," one whispered. "The burned one." Another laughed. "Bet she still smells like smoke." Something inside her cracked, but she didn't move. She just sat at her table and threaded another needle. The laughter faded. The machine started again. Her rebellion was quiet, but it existed. When her father lost his job at the factory, the house grew heavier. Bills stacked up. One night, she found him at the kitchen table, head in his hands. "They said I'm too old," he murmured. "They don't want men like me anymore." His voice broke, and for the first time since the fire, Amira saw him cry. She stood beside him, unsure whether to touch his shoulder or not. Finally she whispered, "We'll be okay." He looked up, his eyes swollen. "You sound like her." That night she went through her mother's old trunk, the one she wasn't supposed to open. Inside were patterns, half-finished sketches, and a small notebook filled with handwriting that trembled between neat and rushed. On the last page her mother had written, "Every stitch is a promise to keep beauty alive, even in ashes." Amira traced the letters with her finger. Her throat tightened. "I'll keep it, Mama," she whispered. She started selling her work quietly. A neighbor who pitied her bought a table runner. A teacher ordered 2 pillow covers. She didn't sign them. Didn't need to. But when she heard her father on the phone with a cousin saying, "Yeah, she sews to pass time," something inside her twisted. To pass time. As if it were just a hobby for someone who couldn't face the world. That night she stayed up until dawn, working on something different, a dress. Not just stitches but a story. She worked through pain. The needle pricked her skin, drew tiny drops of blood that stained the fabric. She didn't stop. Her eyes burned, her back ached, but she kept sewing. By sunrise she held the finished piece in her lap. White cotton, simple, but the hem was embroidered with uneven flowers, scars that bloomed instead of hiding. She held it against her chest, closed her eyes, and for the first time smiled. Weeks passed. She began leaving small designs in the town's donation box, handmade scarves, embroidered napkins. People started noticing. "Who's making these?" someone asked at the bakery. "Whoever it is, they've got talent." Amira listened from the corner, pretending not to care. Her heart beat faster than her words could catch up. But hope doesn't come without a price. At the school fair, she overheard 2 mothers talking near the craft stalls. "Did you see those scarves?" one said. "Beautiful, right?" The other frowned. "They're made by that burned girl I heard." The first woman hesitated. "Oh, I didn't know." They moved to another stall. Amira stood frozen, her smile collapsing. She realized that no matter what she made, people would still see her fire before her fabric. That night she didn't sew. She sat in the dark, staring at her hands. They looked smaller than she remembered, fragile against the machine's metal edge. "What's the point?" she whispered. The room didn't answer. Only the faint tick of the clock filled the air. The next morning, her father found the dress she'd made draped across a chair. "You made this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He touched the fabric gently. "It's beautiful." The word felt different this time. It didn't sound like pity, it sounded like truth. He looked at her, really looked. "You should show people, Amira. Not hide." She wanted to believe him, but years of silence didn't disappear overnight. "They won't see beauty," she said. "They'll just see what's left of me." He placed the dress back down carefully, then let them see both. He left the room, and she sat staring at the dress until sunlight began to fill the window again. The light touched every thread, turning it gold. For a moment, she could almost hear her mother's voice again. By evening, the sewing machine hummed once more. Louder this time, steadier. Her hands moved faster, the needle dancing like it had something to prove. Each stitch carried the weight of all the years she spent hiding, all the words she never said. She was no longer sewing for survival, she was sewing to be seen. Outside, kids passed the house again. "That's where the burned girl lives," one whispered. But the hum inside drowned them out. This time she didn't care. When she finished the last seam, she stood and faced the mirror. Her reflection looked older, steadier, alive. The scars didn't vanish, but they didn't define her either. The dress glowed softly in the lamplight, its white fabric catching every flicker. She smiled, whispering to herself, "They'll see." The machine went silent. The curtain stayed open. And for the first time in years, Amira didn't look away. "Those hands made this?" The woman's voice cut through the market's noise like a spark. Amira froze. She hadn't realized the stall owner had pointed at her while showing the fabric bag she'd made from scraps. The stranger, a tall woman with a calm face and soft eyes, turned to her. You sewed this. Amira hesitated, clutching the edge of her scarf. Ah yes. Just for practice. The woman smiled, not with pity but with something rare, genuine interest. Practice? Then you should keep going. My name's Lila. I run a small studio uptown. We teach design and textile work. Amira blinked, unsure if it was kindness or mockery. I don't have money for that. Lila shook her head. Sometimes talent is payment enough. It was the first time in years anyone used the word talent around her. It echoed louder than the market itself. She followed Lila's gaze to the bag again. The seams weren't perfect, but the pattern was hers. Lila pulled out a card and slid it across the table. Come by tomorrow. If you want to learn, I'll be there. Then she walked away, leaving the card in Amira's trembling hands. That night Amira couldn't sleep. The card sat on her desk, its edges glowing faintly in the lamplight. Lila Design Studio. It read. Below it, a handwritten note. Beauty begins where survival refuses to end. She read the line again and again. Her father was asleep in the next room. The sewing machine stood quietly beside the window, thread still running through the needle. She reached out, touched the metal and whispered, "What if I fail again?" The machine didn't answer. But something inside her, small and steady, whispered back, "You've already survived worse." By morning she had decided. She wrapped her scarf tight to hide her scars and took the bus across town. The city looked different when she wasn't hiding from it. Lila's studio was tucked between a bakery and a hardware shop, its glass windows glowing with sunlight. Inside, rolls of fabric stood like tall soldiers, cotton, silk, denim, colors she'd forgotten the names of. The air smelled of coffee and thread oil. A group of young designers laughed softly over a cutting table. Lila noticed her immediately. "You came," she said, smiling. "Good. Let's get to work." Amira hesitated at the door. "I'm not like them." Lila tilted her head. "Good. The world already has enough like them." She led her to a small table, handed her a piece of chalk and said, "Draw what you see when you close your eyes." Amira stared at the blank fabric, heart pounding. Her palms were sweating under her gloves. Slowly she began to draw, not faces or shapes, but the pattern of firelight she saw behind her eyelids every night. Sharp lines, twisting flames, soft edges turning into petals. When she finished, she looked up nervously. Lila studied it quietly. "It looks like pain," she said finally, "but also like something trying to bloom through it." For the first time in years, Amira smiled. That's what it felt like. Days turned into weeks. Every morning she'd take the bus, her bag filled with old threads and fabrics. She learned to cut patterns again, to let her hands trust themselves. The other students whispered sometimes, "Isn't she that girl from the fire?" But she didn't care. The sound of the sewing machines drowned them out. Her fingers bled again, but this time from work, not shame. Lila pushed her harder each day. "Your stitches tell stories," she'd say. "Let them be honest." One evening, as the class emptied, Lila handed her a folded sketch. "This design is yours now. Finish it." Amira unfolded it carefully. It was a dress, simple, elegant, with flame-shaped embroidery at the sleeves. "It's not perfect," Lila said. "Neither are we." Amira stayed late that night. The studio was quiet except for the hum of one machine and the faint patter of rain outside. She stitched slowly, feeling each thread pull her closer to something she'd lost long ago. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "Every stitch is a promise to keep beauty alive." She whispered the words under her breath, matching her rhythm to the machine. The smell of fabric, the sound of the needle, the flicker of rainlight on the table. It all felt like coming home. When she finished the final seam, she held up the dress. The thread shimmered under the fluorescent light, red and gold intertwining like healing skin. Her reflection in the window caught her by surprise. She didn't look like the broken girl from before. Her scars were still there, but her eyes were different, steadier, alive. The next morning, she carried the dress in a paper bag to the studio. Lila was arranging rolls of fabric. "Let's see," she said. Amira unfolded the dress and placed it on the mannequin. Lila's eyes softened. "You stitched your past into beauty." Amira's throat tightened. "Do you really think it's beautiful?" Lila smiled. "No, I think it's truthful." "That's rarer." Word spread quickly among the students. "She made that. someone whispered. It's incredible. For once the attention didn't sting. It felt earned. She didn't look away when people stared. She met their eyes. That evening, Lila approached her with a quiet excitement. There's an exhibition next month, she said. Young designers from all over the city. You should submit this. Amira shook her head immediately. No. People will see me. That's the point, Lila replied softly. They need to. Amira wanted to refuse. To stay small, hidden, safe. But the thought of the runway, bright lights, eyes watching, not out of cruelty but curiosity, started to feel less terrifying. Maybe even right. She looked at the dress again, the uneven embroidery that somehow worked, the threads that carried her pain like veins of gold. If I show them, she whispered, it has to mean something. Lila nodded. Then let it. For days, Amira worked on refinements. Each stitch became more deliberate, her confidence growing with every seam. One afternoon, a thread snapped mid-stitch. She sighed, ready to curse her luck, but then she smiled. That's okay, she murmured. I know how to fix things now. When the final day of submissions arrived, she stood outside the studio, holding the dress bag tightly. The city buzzed around her, cars, laughter, wind, but she felt calm. Lila joined her at the door. Ready? She asked. Amira took a deep breath. No, she said. But I'm going anyway. Inside, she placed her creation on the submission rack among dozens of others, bright, flawless, untouched by fire. Hers looked different. Real. She turned to leave but paused at the door. The reflection in the glass showed her face beside her dress, both marked, both standing. For the first time she didn't flinch. That night, back at home, she sat beside the window, the card from months ago still pinned to her wall. Rain streaked the glass. The sewing machine waited quietly, its needle gleaming in the dim light. She reached out, brushed her fingers over it and whispered, "We did it, Mama." The rain outside softened to a rhythm like applause. Amira leaned back, closed her eyes and smiled. She wasn't hiding anymore. Something had begun again. Something louder than pain, quieter than hope, but alive. The spark had returned, and this time it was hers to keep. Are you nervous? Lila asked, adjusting the collar of Amira's simple linen dress. The backstage lights burned hot against the air, thick with perfume, nerves, and whispers. Models hurried past. Assistants pinned last-minute hems, the steady thump of music echoing through the walls. Amira nodded, clutching her bag against her chest. Inside it was the dress, the one born from fire, scars, and sleepless nights. The one the world wasn't meant to see. Lila touched her arm. You don't have to prove anything. Just show them truth. The curtain rippled as someone called, 2 minutes. Amira looked at her hand, still marked, still trembling. Every thread she'd ever sewn had led here. The audience beyond that curtain was full of strangers, judges, designers, and maybe even her old classmates. People who once laughed. People who once pitted. She took a breath so deep it felt like stitching her lungs together. Okay, she whispered. The lights dimmed. The first models walked. Applause rose and fell like waves. Amira watched from behind the curtain, her heart beating faster with each step they took. Then Lila's voice came from behind her. Steady, low, certain. You're next. She stepped forward. The spotlight hit her like memory, bright, hot, honest. Gasps rippled through the audience. Not at her scars but at the dress. It glowed under the light, threads of crimson and gold weaving through the white fabric like veins of sunlight through smoke. The embroidery caught the glare and scattered it, turning every flaw into something radiant. Cameras flashed. People leaned forward. Amira felt her body trembling, but not from fear, from release. She reached the center of the runway and stopped. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. She looked straight ahead, not down, not away. Every face blurred into light. She wasn't the burned girl anymore. She wasn't someone to hide. She was the sum of every stitch she'd ever sewn, every night she'd bled into fabric and refused to stop. The fire hadn't ended her. It had shaped her. The applause began slowly, uncertain at first. Then it swelled. Some people stood. Others wiped tears. In the front row, a local journalist whispered, "Who is she?" And Lila replied softly, "The girl who made her pain wear beauty." Amira turned and walked back, the hem of her dress brushing softly against the runway floor. Behind the curtain, Lila caught her in a tight embrace. "You did it," she said. "No," Amira breathed, smiling through tears. "We did." But the night wasn't over. After the show, reporters crowded near the dressing area. "Miss Amira," one called. "What inspired your design?" She froze, her mind empty. Lila nodded at her from across the room. A silent push. Amira stepped closer to the microphone. "I made this dress," she said quietly, "for someone who taught me that beauty doesn't disappear in fire. It just changes shape." Her voice shook but didn't break. "I wanted to show what survival looks like." The crowd fell silent. The words hung in the air like a promise. Cameras flashed again, but she didn't look away this time. She saw faces soften, some in awe, some in guilt, some in quiet admiration. Among them she spotted her father near the doorway, hands folded, eyes glistening. She hadn't told him she was showing the dress. Now seeing him there, she realized he didn't need an invitation to witness her rebirth. When the event ended, he approached her slowly. For a moment they just looked at each other. Then he spoke, his voice thick. "Your mother would have said it's perfect." Amira smiled. "It's not," she said. "But it's real." He nodded, eyes glistening. "That's what makes it perfect." Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint echo of applause. The city lights shimmered on the puddles along the street, reflecting pieces of the dress as she walked. Lila walked beside her, silent, proud. "You changed something tonight," she finally said. Amira shook her head. "No. I just showed them what was always there." They stopped by a shop window. In the glass, Amira saw her reflection. The same scars, the same eyes, but a new calm beneath them. She thought of the nights she'd sewn until her fingers bled, the moment she almost gave up, the cruel words that once lived rent-free in her head. They all seemed distant now, like ashes scattered by wind. A little girl passing by tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mom, look. That's the lady from the show." The mother turned, smiled warmly, and said, "She's beautiful, isn't she?" The girl nodded. Amira blinked hard, her throat tightening. When they reached home, she placed the dress carefully on the mannequin by the window. The moonlight slid across it, touching every seam, every imperfect stitch. The fabric glowed faintly, as if alive. Her father stood behind her, silent for a while, then whispered, "It's like she's here again." Amira nodded. She never left. She sat down at her sewing machine. The familiar hum filled the room once more. But this time it didn't sound like loneliness, it sounded like life. She threaded the needle, smoothed out a piece of fabric, and began to sew again. Not for escape, not for memory, but for creation. Every pull of the thread carried her forward, every stitch echoing the truth that had taken her years to find. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from Lila. "Your dress is trending. They're calling it the fire that bloomed." Amira smiled, shook her head, and typed back, "Let them call it whatever they want. I just called it forgiveness." The clock ticked past midnight. She glanced at her hands, still marked by old flames, now guiding new light. She realized she wasn't trying to erase her scars anymore. She was learning to live inside them, to make them part of her story, not the whole of it. Outside, the city pulsed softly in the distance, but inside her small home, time felt still. She finished one last seam and set the fabric aside. Her mother's sewing machine clicked gently as it stopped, its metal warm under her palm. Amira looked up at the glowing dress one more time. It no longer looked like pain, it looked like peace. A whisper rose in her chest, a voice she hadn't heard in years. Her mother's, faint but certain. "Every stitch is a promise to keep beauty alive." Amira smiled through the quiet, eyes wet but steady. "I kept it, Mama." And as dawn began to rise beyond the window, painting the sky in soft gold, the light touched her scars and turned them into something holy. They tried to erase her face, but she turned her scars into light.